Hey, it's Libby, and I'm breaking in before we start on a fresh Republican-filled episode of Sound Politics, because this week is the KUOW Fall Fundraising Drive. And we here at Sound Politics are just a baby of a podcast. We're brand new. We only started a few months ago, and that's because we considered, what does our audience need right now? What can we help people understand as we move through this weird world that is 2024? And the answer felt pretty obvious. There are important elections coming up this year, but the only reason we were able to jump in and create this show from the ground up on such a quick timeline was because of listeners like you. Your support of KUOW and Sound Politics is what allows us to bring you the stories and interviews that keep you informed about what's happening in Washington politics and beyond. So please, if you haven't already, consider donating. We've got a link on our show notes, or you can always go to KUOW.org for more information. And thank you. Happy birthday, Scott.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my birthday. Yes, I'm a Libra, and I don't want to hear anyone's feelings about Libras or anything that people feel about Libras, but I do think it's funny that almost the final stretch of election season is also Libra season.
I don't speak astrology, so I had to look this up. But Libras are apparently famously crowd-pleasing and approval-seeking. Who does that sound like?
Okay, that's the popular conception of Libras, or misconception, some would say. But maybe, maybe some know it's true, but don't like hearing it. Regardless, it's funny to me that Libra season, shuffles us off at the end of October right into Scorpio season when we vote. That the Scorpio season is the intense, emotional, and brutally honest sign.
Well, I've just been told that I am a Scorpio Sagittarius cusper, a group which has been accused of being aggressive, selfish, and self-righteous.
I don't believe in cusps.
Story checks out, though.
Okay,
now I might be into astrology. So maybe the Greeks knew what they were doing when they made up zodiac signs and democracy.
Great. Libra season's here. The election season in America may be almost over for now, but it's always Sound Politics season.
Welcome to Sound Politics, the show about the people and policies that affect your future in Washington state. I'm KUOW's Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. Our show today is all about the grand old party. You know them, the Republicans. Lots of news in the Republican ranks recently. The Seattle Times reports that the state party is fundraising way less money than the Democrats are. Also, former Republican Governor Dan Evans died last week, and reading obits of him, I was struck, Libby, by how out of place he seemed compared to today's Republican Party. He was a governor starting in the 60s. Evans created the State Department of Ecology, the first environmental protection agency in the country, which Nixon looked to when he was setting up the EPA in 1970.
Oh, that's interesting.
Governor Evans chased the fringe conspiracy theorists out of the party famously, but they have started coming back.
Yeah, the John Birch Society, this anti-communist group that was famously anti-civil rights and anti-Semitic. They had a table, for example, at the Conservative Freedom Fest I went to last month.
And at the state party convention in Spokane in April.
Oh, wow, yeah. And I wonder if Dan Evans at that convention in Spokane would have been welcome these days if he had chosen to attend.
I didn't see him.
Yeah. This was a Republican, Dan Evans, who was fiscally conservative and pushed for a state income tax. He tried to make taxation in the state more fair for the working class. Voters rejected that, and Evans said that it was the biggest disappointment of his political career. And now the pendulum has swung so far, Scott, that the Republicans actually got the Democrats to pass a ban on this state passing an income tax earlier this year.
Yeah. All this got me thinking that, just about the past and the future of the Republican Party. I grew up in a pretty conservative small town, but the Republicanism I knew then, it just seems a lot different than the Republican Party of today.
Yeah, just in my lifetime, it's gone from the party of Reagan to the party of H.W. and W. Bush to the Tea Party to the party of Trump. Realignments happen over time in political parties, but watching the GOP in real time flip from a party of vocal fiscal conservatism, pro-trade, interventionist foreign policy, to this kind of confusing mix today of lip service to economic populism, but with tax cuts that pad the deficit, trade protectionism, isolationism in foreign policy. It's pretty head spinning.
Yeah.
I mean, to see it happen over, the course of a couple decades.
Yeah. And now I've been thinking about this because Trump says if he loses, obviously that's a big if, he says he won't run again. But win or lose, I'm curious where the party goes after him. So to talk about that, we're going to go to the most red part of Washington state to look at maybe the most interesting Republican on Republican race in the nation this November. That election is Washington's 4th congressional district, Yakima, the Tri-Cities, up to Okanogan County and part of the Colville Reservation. It runs like a pillar through the center of the state.
I think of it like a belt through Washington state.
Okay, so Washington
A
State is
fashionable belt.
like sideways. And
yes, exactly.
You don't wear a belt like that. Is that how a dog wears a belt?
Oh, it's like a dog collar.
Okay. There's some really interesting drama going on in the belts or the pillar, whatever it is. We have a Republican who voted to impeach Trump after January 6th, and he's being challenged by a Republican who attended the protest on January 6th. So to help us dig in, we're joined by Orion Donovan Smith, who's covering this race and many others in the PNW for the Spokesman Review. He joins us from the other Washington, D.C. Hey, Orion.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
So you were recently in this district. Can you describe it for folks listening on the west side of the state?
Yeah. So I mean, as you described it, it spans central Washington from the Canadian border down to the Oregon border. It's heavily agricultural, very rural. You do have some larger cities there. The Tri-Cities, Yakima, East Wenatchee. There are urban centers, but it's overwhelmingly rural. And the most conservative district in the state of Washington.
It's really interesting to me that, it's over 40% Hispanic or Latino. I think that's the most in the state. But I don't know, are voters there really conservative, markedly more conservative than like the far east side of the state?
It's important to note, I'm glad you note that it's the most heavily Hispanic district in the state, although a lot of those folks are not citizens and not eligible to vote, so that skews the numbers a little bit, or we should say it doesn't mean they are as big a voting bloc as that might suggest.
Sure.
On the other hand, a lot of them are citizens and voters, and certainly there's a lot of second, third generation community there of folks who moved to the district often as farm workers. There's a lot of agriculture there, particularly really labor-intensive agriculture, like picking tree fruit, hops, things like that. Whereas Eastern Washington has more, wheat, lentils, things like that don't require as much labor, and so that's shaped the district.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Republican who represents it, Dan Newhouse. He's one of 10 Republicans in the House who voted to impeach Trump. And he's now the only one left in his seat who Trump is still actively trying to get rid of. There's one other impeachment Republican in California, but Trump has not backed any challengers to him. So tell me about Dan Newhouse. What are his politics, and how has he survived Trump's efforts to take him out so far?
Yeah, Dan Newhouse is an interesting guy. He's been in Congress now for a decade, but his time in politics goes back well before that. He's actually the son of Irv Newhouse, who was a very prominent Republican in the state legislature. And Dan Newhouse, after himself serving in the state legislature, led the State Department of Agriculture and then was elected to Congress in 2014. He was one of 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump for the then president's role in the January 6th Capitol riot. Newhouse at the time said that didn't only put the blame on Trump, really, but said, we all as Republicans should have been speaking out earlier about some of the falsehoods around the election. And he also had some blame for Democrats in terms of how they handled, for instance, some of the unrest in Seattle that in 2020. But Newhouse was reelected in 2022, despite, as you said, being opposed by Trump endorsing Lauren Culp, who was one of several Republicans to run against Newhouse, really because of our unusual top two primary system in the state. And so rather than a closed party primary where more extreme folks maybe could get to his right, what we saw was Newhouse squeaking by with about a quarter of votes, along with a Democrat, just one Democrat running, Doug White, who got another quarter of votes. And the other half of the electorate was split between a bunch of Trump-aligned Republicans.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's hard to call this district ultra-conservative because you have had these situations like you described where these like kind of more far-right MAGA candidates don't actually win against someone like Newhouse, who is a self-described, conservative, but is just not as much a MAGA person. So Newhouse did not do great in the primary last month, although it was crowded. And the front runner was this former NASCAR driver endorsed by Trump named Jerrod Sessler. Orion, there are obviously some very clear policy differences between Newhouse and Sessler on things like taxes or immigration policy. Can you just give us a quick look at how these two candidates are different?
Yeah, so Jerrod Sessler is an interesting guy. He grew up, spent most of his life in Burien, went to high school in White Center, and only in the last few years did he relocate across the Cascades. He bought about 70 acres on the Yakima River in Prosser. He has really set himself up as an outside the box kind of guy. He talked to me about not only his what he was up to on January 6th, 2021, when he was attended Trump's speech on the Ellipse and then was outside the Capitol. He said he didn't go inside. But he has really set himself up as a Trump-aligned guy, as someone who's opposed to government being too involved in your life. For instance, he talked to me about his personal frustration with having to pay taxes after buying this land, and really kind of wanting to set up a sort of self-sustaining homestead kind of operation there. He calls it a ranch. I don't know that it's quite a ranch. He has a few cattle, has a couple of hogs, some chickens, and has this sort of vision of self-sufficiency there. Now, one of the sort of points of controversy that came up in the primary is that Sessler, who survived cancer a couple decades ago, had gone on a raw food diet, basically a vegan diet. And Tiffany Smiley, running against him, brought that up and attacked him as a vegan, which in a district with a lot of cattle
I was obsessed
is not
with
a good look.
this. Yeah, Tiffany Smiley, former Senate candidate in Washington State. She's running against him, eventually also got a Trump nod for that race. And the big hit that she tries to land on Jerrod Sessler is he's a vegan and he wants to tax cattle. And Sessler ends up having to release this ad that's called Settle the Beef, where he literally cuts into a big beef rib and chews on it and just proves that he's not actually a vegan.
Some of the lies my opponents have been spreading are downright ridiculous. So let's settle the beef. I'm a cattle-raising, gun-carrying, brisket-loving conservative, and I believe in the American dream. I believe in...
Orion, that kind of brings up this rivalry between Smiley and Sessler in the primary. One of the things that intrigued me about the race was the strategy that Newhouse backers pursued to try to get him through with these two other Republicans running pretty strongly. Politico reported earlier this month that a pack of centrist Republicans who supported Dan Newhouse spent $35,000 to text MAGA voters in the district, not to get them to vote for Newhouse, but to get them to vote for Jerrod Sessler. So they were boosting Sessler over a Republican, Smiley, who was seen as more moderate and a bigger threat to Newhouse. Smiley and Sessler, again, both Trump endorsed. The centrists seem to think that Sessler would definitely be the easier win for Newhouse in November, even though he got more votes in the primary than Newhouse eventually. Did you think that was a good investment on the part of these centrist Republicans to boost Sessler?
We'll have to wait and see if it was a good investment in terms of giving Newhouse a more beatable candidate in November. But we do know that they value Newhouse as this sort of moderate guy who's willing to work across the aisle, work on issues like immigration reform, which has been a big issue he's championed, particularly for farm workers. On the other hand, Jerrod Sessler is a guy who really aligns himself with the House Freedom Caucus. He says he wants to be a vocal right-wing conservative. Like, he compares himself to Jim Jordan or Matt Gaetz, some of these guys who are really committed to sort of obstructing or being loud in the House, if not necessarily working with their own party.
They like throwing a wrench in things.
Yeah.
I know we're talking about Republicans this episode, but in this race, Democrats and independents, they do exist in this district, and they're actually going to be key. Do you think they're more likely to vote for Newhouse than just like, I don't know, third party or writing someone in?
You would think so. And certainly, anecdotally, when I talk to Democrats in the district, they are more inclined to vote for Newhouse. The issue is really, do they vote at all, or do they write in somebody else? For instance, Doug White, who's a Democrat who ran against Newhouse 2 years ago and is not exactly a fan of Dan Newhouse, he told me he is going to vote for Newhouse. He is going to make the case to his fellow Democrats in the district they should vote for Newhouse. And some of the county-level Democratic leaders in the district have said the same. The difference is, of course, they're not. They generally aren't making formal endorsements of a Republican candidate, but that could have some effect.
Let's step back for the last part of our show and talk about what this race says about Republicans writ large, right? Republicans throughout the country. A lot of the old guard conservatives that I've talked to in Washington State, at least, have floated away from the party, or they feel like it's running away from them. And they hope it'll come back to a free market, small government place one day after Trump leaves. But I'm curious, Orion, is that what Newhouse is waiting for, or Republicans like him? What's his long-term plan?
The rumor mill, if you pay attention to that, suggests that Newhouse is getting close to retirement, and there was in fact a lot of speculation that he might retire this year and not run for re-election.
Yeah. Libby, I want to hear what you think about this in this bigger question. Like, we've got the vice presidential debate coming up on Tuesday, and some people think of J.D. Vance, right, Trump's running mate, as the next generation. What do you think? Where is the Republican Party headed?
Yeah, I mean, talk of Trump leaving when we have this incredibly tight presidential race, tightest, in my memory, is probably premature. But certainly a lot of folks are talking about it when you have somebody who is at the age of Trump and unlikely to have a super long political future. The J.D. Vance pick in general was seen as this MAGA legacy pick, right? Rather than a choice that would have helped him shore up key constituencies, key voter blocks, moderates, that would have been the Doug Burgum pick, or Latino men, Marco Rubio. The Trump phenomenon for me has always been a little hard to understand, being a coastal elite, but also from like the GOP strategy perspective, because Republicans have really lost ground with him at the head of the party. They're underperforming in congressional contests in 2018, 2020, 2022. Trump backs candidates in winnable races that end up losing, from Herschel Walker, frankly, to Joe Kent in the third in Washington State. If Trump loses in November and the party tries to move on, there is going to be this scramble to replace him as the MAGA mantle holder, the person at the front of that movement. Liz Cheney suggested last week that there is this need for a new political party for disaffected Republicans. Parties have changed and even collapsed over the years. Like, who doesn't remember the Whig Party ending in the 1850s? Right. But when it comes to the future of the Republican Party after Trump, I think that races like this one in central Washington, Newhouse and Sessler, are going to tell us a lot about where MAGA goes and whether we return to more of a mean in the party.
Yeah, Orion, you went to the RNC earlier this year and talked to Republicans from the PNW. Did you get any sense of what they see in the future, maybe after Trump? Yeah,
on one hand, the RNC is a big party for Trump fans, really, at this point. Trump has very much defined the party. Now, that's not to say there aren't Republicans who don't like Trump, but for the most part, they were not hanging out in Milwaukee at the RNC. I will say, though, that when people showed up, for instance, we had Mitch McConnell there. He got booed when he spoke. There were signs that the party is not entirely unified behind Donald Trump. But when I talked to especially Washington and Idaho delegates there, they were just absolutely fired up. They loved Trump, and they were excited about the future sort of J.D. Vance-led Republican Party.
Okay. And just for local context, the Trump era has not been good for Washington Republicans, right? They lost the state Senate the year after he was elected, and since 2020, they've lost every single statewide seat. I mentioned the party's fundraising woes at the top of the show, but I think it's worthwhile to back it up. Like the Dems had over $4 million in their state accounts at the end of August, and Republicans had roughly 76,000. I don't think that's instilling any confidence in anyone that they're going to be super competitive in Washington.
And that's not even, pointing to the huge gulf in fundraising between Bob Ferguson and Dave Reichert.
Oh.
Ferguson's got 11 million. Dave Reichert's got like 5. I mean, less than half. I do think Republicans, though, are spending a lot of energy and money on these initiatives that are on the ballot.
Sure.
So repealing the Climate Commitment Act, the capital gains tax, and just generally rolling back these big laws that Democrats had as their priorities in the legislature. I wonder if it's just going to be the Republican Party's strategy going forward to work outside the legislative system, not focus so much on candidates, but more on this direct democracy stuff.
Yeah, move away from the Republican brand if they don't think it's popular with voters. I think, whether or not they do that more depends on whether these initiatives pass in November. But that is all the time we have for this week. We'll be thinking about the future of the Republican Party on Tuesday when never-Trumper turned VP pick J.D. Vance takes the stage. Meanwhile, Orion, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Orion Donovan Smith is the D.C.-based reporter with the Spokesman Review.
Thanks, Orion.
That's it for Sound Politics. Today's episode was produced by Sarah Leibovitz. It was edited by Catharine Smith.
I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. Thanks for listening. And thank you to our listener, Adam, for donating.
Thanks, Adam.
We see every one of your donations with our own 2 eyes, and we jump up from our chairs and do a little dance when they come through. So if you want to thrill us, support what we do here, go right now to the link in the show notes and donate. Or it's super easy. You can just type it into your browser while you're listening to this. It's KUOW.org/politics.
It's the perfect time if you've been thinking about donating to KUOW for a little bit, but you just haven't gotten around to it. It's KUOW.org/politics. Donating there tells us and the station that you really care about this podcast. So thank you so much, Adam, and everyone who has donated to Sound Politics that way. And hey, we would love to know your thoughts on the podcast so far. Share your feedback or questions at soundpolitics@KUOW.org or leave us a good old-fashioned voicemail at 206-221-0511. Thanks, everybody. I have done a little bit more research, and I understand that I am a Moodang Sun, a Lisa Simpson Moon, and a Matlock Rising.
A what?
Matlock. Yes.
Okay, Moodang Sun.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Lisa Simpson
Which is my
Moon?
spirit.
Why Lisa Simpson Moon?
Lisa Simpson Moon. Do you think I'm a Lisa Simpson Rising? That's also possible.